The courtroom buzzed with the usual hum of murmured conversations, the shuffling of papers, and the occasional cough echoing off the high ceilings. It was a typical morning in Judge Richard Hawthorne's courtroom, a place where justice was supposed to be blind but often felt more like a stage for power plays. The judge sat tall behind his bench, his stern face framed by graying hair and sharp eyes that seemed to pierce through anyone who dared meet his gaze. Known for his no-nonsense attitude and biting remarks, he wasn't exactly beloved by those who appeared before him. To many, Judge Hawthorne was less of a fair arbiter and more of an intimidating figure who thrived on making others squirm. Today's case seemed routine enough, a dispute over unpaid property taxes. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that would make headlines or stir emotions, or so everyone thought. Standing at the defendant's table was a woman who looked completely out of place in the formal setting of the courtroom. She wore a simple blouse and skirt, her dark hair tied back in a neat bun. There were no expensive suits, no flashy accessories, just an air of quiet determination that somehow made her stand out even more. Her name was Clara Bennett, a single mother in her mid-30s who worked as a librarian in a small town nearby. Clara had inherited a piece of land from her late parents, a patch of green nestled between rolling hills and dense woods. It wasn't much, but it meant the world to her. It was home. Recently, however, she'd received a notice claiming she owed thousands of dollars in back taxes. Confused and frustrated, she tried to sort things out herself, only to hit one bureaucratic wall after another. When appeals and letters went unanswered, she realized she had no choice but to take her fight to court. But hiring a lawyer was out of the question. Every penny she earned went toward raising her teenage daughter and keeping a roof over their heads. So armed with nothing but her wits and hours spent poring over legal texts in the library, Clara decided to represent herself. As the bailiff called the courtroom to order, Judge Hawthorne glanced down at the file in front of him. He skimmed through the details, his expression unimpressed. Another self-represented litigant, he thought dismissively. Over the years, he'd seen plenty of them. People who walked into his courtroom thinking they could outsmart seasoned attorneys without any real understanding of the law. More often than not, they ended up embarrassed, their arguments falling apart under the slightest scrutiny. This case, he assumed, would be no different. "Ms. Bennett," Judge Hawthorne began, his voice dripping with condescension, "do you understand how these proceedings work? Or are we wasting everyone's time here?" Clara looked up, meeting his gaze steadily despite the weight of his authority pressing down on her. She nodded once, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied softly but firmly. "I do." Her calm demeanor caught him off guard for a split second, though he quickly masked it with a sarcastic smirk. "Well then," he said, leaning back in his chair, "let's see if you can keep up." What Judge Hawthorne didn't know, and what no one else in the room suspected, was that beneath Clara's unassuming exterior lay a mind sharper than most. Years ago, long before life took its twists and turns, she had been at the top of her class in law school, earning accolades and opportunities that could have led her down a very different path. But when tragedy struck her family, Clara chose to step away from the legal world entirely, focusing instead on raising her daughter and finding solace in the quiet rhythm of small-town life. Still, she never lost her love for the law. In fact, she spent countless evenings reading case studies, analyzing statutes, and staying informed about legal developments. For Clara, the law wasn't just a profession. It was a tool for fairness, a way to ensure that even the smallest voices could be heard. The opposing counsel, a well-dressed man representing the county tax authority, rose to present his case. His tone was confident, almost smug, as he outlined why Clara owed the disputed amount. He spoke of assessments and regulations, tossing around terms that sounded impressive but carried little substance. Throughout his presentation, Judge Hawthorne watched Clara closely, waiting for signs of confusion or panic. Surely, he thought, she wouldn't last 5 minutes against someone like this. But when it was her turn to speak, something remarkable happened. Clara stood up slowly, her movements deliberate and steady. She adjusted the collar of her blouse, took a deep breath, and began to talk. At first her voice was soft, almost hesitant, but as she gained momentum, It grew stronger, clearer. What followed was nothing short of astonishing. Clara started citing specific laws and precedents, referencing obscure sections of tax codes with precision that left both the opposing counsel and Judge Hawthorne momentarily stunned. She pointed out inconsistencies in the county's assessment process, explaining how outdated zoning maps had led to inflated property values. Each point she made was backed by solid evidence, each argument delivered with clarity and conviction. The room fell silent, save for the scratching of pens as spectators scribbled notes or whispered to one another in disbelief. Judge Hawthorne leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowing as he listened intently. He had expected tears, stammering, maybe even outright defiance, but this was something entirely unexpected. Clara wasn't just holding her ground. She was dismantling the prosecution's case brick by brick, exposing cracks in their arguments that no one else had noticed. By the time she finished speaking, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. The opposing counsel shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly rattled. Even Judge Hawthorne, who prided himself on remaining impartial, couldn't hide the flicker of surprise in his eyes. He cleared his throat, buying himself a moment to collect his thoughts. Then, with a mixture of irritation and reluctant admiration, he addressed Clara again. "Well, Miss Bennett," he said, his tone less condescending now. "You certainly seem to know your stuff." Clara simply nodded, her expression unchanged. Inside, however, she allowed herself a small spark of hope. She hadn't come here seeking recognition or applause. She'd come to fight for what was right, and judging by the looks on everyone's faces, she might actually have a chance. The courtroom was eerily quiet after Clara finished her initial argument. Even the opposing counsel, a seasoned lawyer who had spent years perfecting his craft, seemed unsure of what to say next. He glanced down at his notes, flipping through pages as if searching for something, anything that could counter Clara's points. But the truth was, he hadn't expected this. No one had. Judge Hawthorne sat frozen for a moment, his pen hovering above the notepad in front of him. His reputation for being sharp-tongued and unyielding wasn't just a rumor. It was a well-established fact. Over the years, he'd built a name for himself by tearing apart weak arguments and humiliating those who dared to challenge the system without proper preparation. Yet here he was, staring at a woman who didn't fit the mold of the typical, self-represented litigant. She wasn't flustered or intimidated. Instead, she stood calmly, waiting for the next move like a chess player who already knew her opponent's strategy. "Ms. Bennett," Judge Hawthorne finally said, leaning forward slightly, his voice carrying a hint of curiosity now. "Where did you learn all this? These aren't exactly beginner-level concepts." Clara hesitated for a brief second before answering. She didn't want to come across as boastful or defensive, but she also knew honesty was her best approach. "I studied law once, Your Honor," she replied softly, her tone respectful yet unwavering. "A long time ago. Life took me in a different direction, but I never stopped reading about it. When I realized I needed to fight for my property, I went back to the books. I figured if I couldn't afford a lawyer, I'd have to become one, for myself at least." Her words hung in the air, simple yet profound. The courtroom remained silent, everyone processing what they'd just heard. A librarian who used to study law? It sounded almost too good to be true. But the evidence was right there in front of them. Clara's arguments were solid, backed by facts and legal principles that even experienced attorneys might struggle to recall offhand. The opposing counsel cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. "Your Honor," he began, his voice firmer now, though there was a noticeable edge of discomfort. "While Ms. Bennett may have presented some interesting points, we still maintain that the assessment process followed standard procedures. Any discrepancies are likely due to clerical errors rather than intentional misconduct." It was a clever attempt to deflect attention away from Clara's accusations, but it didn't work. Judge Hawthorne wasn't buying it, not entirely anyway. He turned his piercing gaze toward the attorney. "Clerical errors?" he repeated skeptically. "That seems awfully convenient, doesn't it? Especially when Ms. Bennett has provided documentation showing otherwise." The tension in the room thickened. The opposing counsel shifted in his seat again, visibly rattled. He fumbled through his papers, trying to find something, anything, that could bolster his claim. But every document he referenced only seemed to reinforce Clara's position further. She had done her homework, leaving no stone unturned. Every loophole, every inconsistency, had been meticulously identified and addressed. As the hearing continued, Clara remained composed, speaking only when necessary and always with purpose. Her responses were concise, her demeanor calm. There was no trace of arrogance or triumph in her expression, just a quiet resolve that commanded respect. Even the bailiff, who had seen countless cases come and go, found himself glancing at her, occasionally impressed by her poise under pressure. Meanwhile, Judge Hawthorne's attitude began to shift ever so slightly. At first it was subtle, a pause before interrupting her, a nod of acknowledgement when she made a particularly strong point. But as the morning wore on, it became clear that he was genuinely intrigued by Clara. This wasn't just about winning or losing anymore. It was about understanding how someone who appeared so ordinary could possess such extraordinary knowledge. During a short recess, Judge Hawthorne retreated to his chambers, leaving the courtroom buzzing with whispers. Spectators exchanged theories about Clara's background, while reporters scribbled notes furiously, eager to capture every detail of the unfolding drama. Some speculated that she must have had secret help from a professional lawyer. Others wondered if she was hiding some kind of hidden agenda. But most agreed on one thing: whatever was happening here was far from ordinary. Back in the courtroom, Clara sat quietly at the defendant's table, sipping water from a small bottle. She wasn't celebrating or gloating. Instead, she seemed focused, almost meditative. Her thoughts weren't on the spectacle around her, but on the task ahead. She knew the battle wasn't over yet. Winning wasn't guaranteed, no matter how strong her arguments were. Still, she allowed herself a flicker of hope. For the first time since this ordeal began, she felt like she might actually have a chance. When the session resumed, Judge Hawthorne returned to the bench looking thoughtful. He wasted no time diving back into the case, peppering both sides with questions designed to test their arguments. To the opposing counsel, his tone remained critical, probing for weaknesses. But when he addressed Clara, there was a new undertone to his voice, one of cautious admiration. "Ms. Bennett," he said during one exchange, "you've raised some compelling issues regarding the zoning maps used in your property's assessment. Can you elaborate further on why you believe these maps are outdated?" Clara nodded, ready for the question. She pulled out a folder containing photocopies of the maps in question, along with letters she had sent to various county offices requesting clarification. As she spoke, her explanations were clear and methodical, painting a picture of negligence that was hard to ignore. By the time she finished, even the opposing counsel looked uneasy, realizing that his earlier attempts to dismiss her claims wouldn't hold up under scrutiny. The day ended with Judge Hawthorne announcing that he would need more time to review the evidence before delivering a verdict. As the courtroom emptied, spectators lingered, discussing the events of the day with a mix of excitement and disbelief. Reporters swarmed around Clara, firing questions at her as she gathered her belongings. She answered patiently, keeping her responses brief and focused. "I'm not doing this for attention," she told them firmly. "I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do. Everyone deserves a fair shot regardless of who they are or where they come from." Her words resonated deeply, not just with the reporters but with everyone who had witnessed her performance. Here was a woman who had faced adversity head-on, refusing to back down despite overwhelming odds. She wasn't motivated by fame or revenge. She simply wanted justice, for herself and for others like her. As Clara walked out of the courthouse, the weight of the day's events settled heavily on her shoulders. Exhaustion tugged at her, but so did a sense of accomplishment. She had proven that she belonged in that courtroom, that she could stand toe-to-toe with professionals and hold her own. And while the final outcome was still uncertain, she knew one thing for sure: she had already won a victory simply by refusing to be silenced. The next morning, Judge Hawthorne arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual. He wasn't one to dwell on cases once they were adjourned, but something about Clara's presence lingered in his mind. It wasn't just her legal acumen that intrigued him. It was her quiet confidence, her refusal to be intimidated by a system designed to overwhelm people like her. As he sat in his chambers, sipping his coffee, he found himself wondering how someone with such talent had ended up as a librarian. Instead of practicing law, curiosity got the better of him. Before the day's proceedings began, he instructed his clerk to dig into Clara's background. "Find out everything you can about her," he said firmly, though there was a hint of curiosity rather than suspicion in his voice. The clerk nodded and quickly set to work. What the clerk uncovered surprised even Judge Hawthorne. Clara had graduated at the top of her class from one of the most prestigious law schools in the country. Her professors had praised her brilliance, calling her a natural-born advocate with an uncanny ability to dissect complex legal issues. She had been offered positions at some of the biggest law firms in the nation, each promising her a bright future filled with wealth and recognition. But then, something changed. After finishing law school, Clara vanished from the legal scene entirely. No bar registration, no job applications, no trace of her pursuing a career in law. Instead, she moved back to her hometown, took up a modest job at the local library, and quietly disappeared from public view. The clerk also discovered that Clara's husband had passed away unexpectedly just a few years after she graduated. Left alone to raise their young daughter, Clara made the decision to step away from the high-pressure world of law and focus on building a stable life for her child. Despite this, she never stopped studying or staying updated on legal developments. Friends and colleagues described her as someone who lived simply, but carried an immense reservoir of knowledge within her. To them, it came as no surprise that she could hold her own in a courtroom, even against seasoned professionals. When Judge Hawthorne read the report, he felt a pang of guilt gnawing at him. His initial judgment of Clara, based solely on her appearance and lack of formal representation, now seemed not only unfair but embarrassingly shallow. Here was a woman who had sacrificed her ambitions for her family, yet still retained the skills and determination to take on powerful institutions when necessary. He realized that beneath her calm exterior lay a depth of character and resilience that few possessed. Meanwhile, word about Clara's performance in court spread like wildfire. Local news outlets picked up the story, painting her as an underdog, hero standing up against bureaucratic arrogance. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, hoping to catch glimpses of her arriving for the day's hearing. Social media buzzed with hashtags like Clara vs. the system and justice for all, turning her case into a rallying cry for ordinary people everywhere. Strangers reached out to offer support, sharing stories of their own battles with unfair systems, and expressing admiration for Clara's courage. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted noticeably. Spectators packed the benches, eager to witness the unfolding drama. Some brought notebooks, jotting down every detail of the proceedings. Others whispered excitedly among themselves, speculating about what Clara might say next. Even the opposing counsel seemed more cautious now, aware that any misstep could further damage his case and his reputation. As the session began, Judge Hawthorne called the courtroom to order. His tone was measured, almost reflective, as he addressed both parties. "We will continue today where we left off yesterday," he announced. "Ms. Bennett, you may proceed." Clara stood up slowly, adjusting the plain folder in her hands. If she noticed the heightened attention surrounding her, she didn't show it. Her focus remained laser-sharp, her expression calm and composed. She started by addressing the inconsistencies in the county's assessment process, presenting additional evidence that reinforced her earlier arguments. Each document she introduced was accompanied by a clear explanation, leaving little room for doubt about its significance. At one point, she pulled out a series of photographs showing the actual condition of her property compared to the exaggerated descriptions provided in the assessment report. "Your Honor," she said, holding up the photos for everyone to see, "this is what my land looks like. It's not a sprawling estate or a commercial hotspot. It's a modest piece of land surrounded by nature, a place I inherited from my parents and have worked hard to maintain. Yet, according to the county's records, it's valued as if it's prime real estate ready for development. How does that make sense?" Her question hung in the air, simple yet profound. The opposing counsel tried to argue that valuation methods were standard across all properties, but Clara cut him off with a pointed rebuttal. "Standard doesn't mean accurate," she countered. "If the maps you're using are outdated and don't reflect reality, then your entire assessment is flawed. You can't justify taxing me based on information that isn't true." Judge Hawthorne listened intently, his pen moving steadily across his notepad. He interjected occasionally, asking clarifying questions or requesting specific details. Unlike before, his tone was respectful, almost encouraging. It was as if he wanted to understand every nuance of Clara's argument, ensuring nothing was overlooked. By midday, the momentum had clearly shifted in Clara's favor. The opposing counsel grew increasingly flustered, his responses becoming shorter and less convincing. At one point, Judge Hawthorne interrupted him with a sharp remark. "Counselor, I suggest you stop dancing around the issue and address the discrepancies Ms. Bennett has raised. Unless, of course, you have a valid explanation for why these errors occurred." The room fell silent, the weight of the judge's words sinking in. The opposing counsel stammered briefly before admitting that an internal review might be necessary to clarify the matter. It was a rare concession, one that signaled the beginning of the end for his side. Outside the courtroom, the crowd erupted, in murmurs of approval. People exchanged knowing glances, nodding in agreement as they discussed how Clara was dismantling the prosecution's case piece by piece. Reporters scrambled to capture reactions from spectators, many of whom praised Clara's intelligence and perseverance. One elderly man summed it up best. "She's fighting for more than just herself. She's fighting for all of us who feel like the system doesn't care." Back inside, Clara remained unfazed by the growing support. She wasn't there to win applause or gain followers. She was there to prove her innocence and expose the flaws in a process that affected countless others. As the afternoon wore on, she continued to present her case with precision and clarity, never losing sight of her goal. Judge Hawthorne watched her closely, his earlier skepticism replaced by reluctant admiration. He couldn't help but marvel at how effortlessly she navigated the complexities of the law, turning what could have been an overwhelming challenge into a masterclass in advocacy. By the time the session concluded, it was clear to everyone, including the judge, that Clara wasn't just a simple woman caught in a legal dispute. She was a force to be reckoned with, a reminder that true strength often comes from unexpected places. As the courtroom emptied, Clara gathered her belongings and slipped out quietly, avoiding the throngs of reporters waiting outside. She didn't need the spotlight. She needed justice. And with each passing day, she was proving that she deserved it, not just for herself, but for everyone who believed in fairness and truth. The courtroom was buzzing with anticipation as the fourth day of the trial began. By now, Clara's case had become more than just a legal battle. It was a symbol of hope for ordinary people everywhere. The benches were packed with spectators, some who had traveled from neighboring towns just to witness the showdown between Clara and the county's legal team. Reporters lined the back of the room, cameras clicking and notebooks filling up with scribbled observations. Even Judge Hawthorne seemed unusually alert, his eyes scanning the room as if sensing that today might be pivotal. Clara entered quietly, carrying her folder of documents and notes. She wore the same simple outfit she'd worn on the first day, but there was something different about her demeanor now. It wasn't arrogance or triumph, far from it. Instead, she carried herself with a quiet confidence, like someone who knew they were doing the right thing regardless of the outcome. As she took her seat at the defendant's table, she glanced briefly at the crowd before focusing entirely on the task ahead. The opposing counsel stood to present his closing arguments, but it was clear he was struggling. Over the past few days, Clara had systematically dismantled every point he'd made, exposing flaws in the county's assessment process and casting doubt on the fairness of their methods. He tried to sound authoritative, emphasizing procedural rules and technicalities, but his words lacked conviction. Every time he spoke, it felt like he was grasping at straws, trying desperately to regain control of a situation that had spiraled far beyond his expectations. Judge Hawthorne listened intently, his expression unreadable. When the opposing counsel finished, the judge leaned forward slightly, addressing him directly. "Counselor," he said, his tone firm but measured, "you've mentioned several times that these assessments follow standard procedures, but Ms. Bennett has provided substantial evidence suggesting otherwise. Are you prepared to explain why your office used outdated zoning maps when assessing her property?" The opposing counsel shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his tie as if buying himself a moment to think. "Your Honor," he replied, his voice tinged with frustration, "the maps in question were part of a larger database maintained by multiple departments. Any discrepancies are likely due to administrative oversight, not intentional misconduct." "Administrative oversight?" Judge Hawthorne repeated, raising an eyebrow. His tone was skeptical, almost mocking. "That's quite convenient, isn't it? Especially when those oversights seem to benefit the county financially." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and the opposing counsel flushed red. He opened his mouth to respond, but thought better of it, opting instead to sit down without further comment. It was a rare moment of silence from someone who had spent most of the trial talking confidently, but now seemed unsure of what to say. When it was Clara's turn to speak, the room fell silent. She rose slowly, her movements deliberate and calm. She didn't need dramatic gestures or loud declarations. Her presence alone commanded attention. She began by summarizing her key points, reiterating how the outdated maps had led to an inflated valuation of her property. Then she introduced new evidence, a letter from a retired county assessor who had come forward after hearing about her case. "This letter," Clara explained, holding it up for everyone to see, "confirms what I've been saying all along. The maps used in my assessment haven't been updated in over a decade. They don't reflect current conditions or zoning laws. Yet no one bothered to double-check them before sending me a tax bill that was wildly inaccurate." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "I'm not asking for special treatment," she continued, her voice steady and sincere. "All I want is fairness. If the system is broken, and it clearly is, then we need to fix it. Not just for me, but for everyone else who might face the same problem in the future." Her final statement struck a chord with everyone in the room. Spectators nodded in agreement while reporters furiously jotted down her words. Even Judge Hawthorne looked moved, his earlier skepticism replaced by a growing sense of respect. For the first time, he realized that this case wasn't just about unpaid taxes. It was about accountability, transparency, and ensuring that the law worked for everyone, not just those in power. After Clara finished speaking, Judge Hawthorne called for a recess. As the courtroom emptied, whispers filled the air. People discussed Clara's arguments, marveling at how she had turned the tables so effectively. Some praised her courage, while others expressed outrage at the county's handling of her case. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded Clara, firing questions at her as she walked toward her car. She answered patiently, keeping her responses brief and focused. "I didn't expect any of this attention," she admitted, gesturing to the cameras and microphones pointed at her. "I'm just a regular person trying to do the right thing. If sharing my story helps others realize they have a voice too, then maybe something good can come out of all this." Her humility only added to her appeal. By the end of the day, social media was flooded with posts supporting her cause. Hashtags like Tower Fairness for All and Stand with Clara trended locally, drawing attention to broader issues within the tax assessment system. People shared stories of their own struggles with similar cases, highlighting how widespread the problem really was. Back in his chambers, Judge Hawthorne sat alone, reflecting on the day's events. He couldn't shake the feeling that Clara's case represented a turning point, not just for her, but for the entire community. For years, he had prided himself on being tough, on maintaining order in his courtroom no matter what. But now, he found himself questioning whether toughness alone was enough. Wasn't justice supposed to serve the people? And if the system failed to do that, wasn't it his duty to hold it accountable? He picked up the file containing Clara's evidence and flipped through it again. Each document reinforced her claims, painting a picture of negligence and systemic failure. It was undeniable. The county had made mistakes, and those mistakes had real consequences for ordinary citizens like Clara. He knew what he had to do next, but it wouldn't be easy. When the trial resumed later that afternoon, Judge Hawthorne delivered a ruling that shocked everyone. Based on the evidence presented, he announced, his voice echoing through the silent courtroom, I find in favor of the defendant. The assessment of Ms. Bennett's property was indeed flawed, and therefore the disputed taxes are nullified. Gasps rippled through the room, followed by applause from the spectators. Clara sat motionless for a moment, processing the verdict. Then she stood up slowly, bowing her head slightly in gratitude. There was no cheering, no celebration, just a quiet dignity that matched her character. As the courtroom emptied, Judge Hawthorne approached Clara privately. Ms. Bennett, he said, extending his hand, you've taught me something valuable. Today, justice isn't about appearances or assumptions, it's about truth and fairness. Thank you for reminding me of that. Clara shook his hand, her expression softening. Thank you, Your Honor, she replied simply, for listening. It was a small gesture, but it carried immense meaning. In that moment, two very different people connected, not as adversaries, but as human beings committed to the same goal, making the world a little fairer, one step at a time. After the intense courtroom battle, something unexpected happened. Judge Hawthorne, who had started off treating Clara with such disdain, found himself unable to ignore what he'd witnessed. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of humility wash over him. It wasn't just about losing an argument or being proven wrong. It was about realizing how much he'd underestimated someone because of appearances. He sat alone in his chambers after delivering the verdict in Clara's favor, staring at the empty chair where she had stood so confidently just moments before. The judge knew he couldn't let this moment pass without acknowledging it publicly. The next morning, during a press conference held outside the courthouse, cameras flashed as reporters jostled for position. Judge Hawthorne stepped up to the microphone, cleared his throat, and began speaking. His voice carried a tone that many hadn't heard from him before, honesty mixed with respect. I owe Ms. Bennett an apology, he said, looking directly into the crowd. When she walked into my courtroom, I judged her based on what I saw. A quiet woman, no flashy suit, no team of lawyers by her side. I assumed she wouldn't last 5 minutes against seasoned attorneys. But I was wrong, dead wrong. He paused, letting those words sink in. Reporters scribbled furiously while some listeners exchanged surprised glances. This wasn't the same man who had mocked Clara earlier in the trial. Ms. Bennett reminded me, and everyone here, what true advocacy looks like. She fought, not just for herself, but for fairness, for truth. And she did it better than most people I've seen in decades on the bench. His admission sent ripples through the room. People whispered among themselves, impressed by the rare display of vulnerability from a figure of authority. Some even clapped softly, though the atmosphere remained respectful. When the judge finished speaking, Clara was nowhere to be found. She hadn't stayed to hear the praise. She simply wanted the case resolved and justice served. But Clara's story didn't end there. News outlets picked up the tale quickly, turning her into an overnight sensation. Stories about the librarian who outsmarted the system spread across newspapers, social media, and television shows. Reporters camped outside her modest home, hoping to catch a glimpse of her or get an interview. Offers poured in from big law firms offering her lucrative positions, promising fame and wealth if she joined their ranks. Some even suggested she run for public office, given her knack for standing up to powerful institutions. Yet Clara turned them all down. She wasn't interested in climbing any ladder of success or basking in the spotlight. Instead, she focused on something far more meaningful. Remembering the struggles she faced navigating the legal system alone, she decided to help others like her, ordinary people caught in unfair situations, unsure of how to fight back. With the little money she had saved, she founded a nonprofit organization aimed at providing free legal resources and guidance to individuals dealing with similar challenges. Her nonprofit became a beacon of hope for countless families and individuals. Volunteers, including retired lawyers, paralegals, and even college students studying law, flocked to join her cause. Together they created workshops, online guides, and community seminars to educate people about their rights and how to navigate bureaucratic hurdles. Clara often led these sessions herself, sharing not only her knowledge but also her personal experiences. Her message was always clear. You don't have to be a lawyer to stand up for yourself. All you need is determination and a willingness to learn. As word of her efforts spread, Clara received invitations to speak at conferences and universities. At one event, she addressed a packed auditorium filled with aspiring lawyers and activists. Standing behind the podium, she shared her journey in simple yet powerful terms. "I didn't set out to become anyone's hero," she told the audience. "I just wanted to protect my family and make sure the system treated me fairly. Along the way, I realized that fighting for justice isn't about titles or degrees. It's about believing in what's right and refusing to give up no matter how hard things get." Her speech earned a standing ovation, and many attendees approached her afterward to thank her personally. Some were moved to tears, saying her story inspired them to pursue careers in public service. Others promised to use their skills to help underserved communities. Clara listened to each person patiently, offering encouragement and advice whenever asked. Back in her hometown, life slowly returned to normal, or as normal as it could be for someone now considered a local legend. One day, while visiting the Iki library where she used to work, Clara noticed a new addition near the entrance. A brass plaque hung proudly on the wall commemorating her achievements. Beneath her name was an inscription that perfectly captured her spirit. "Justice begins when ordinary people refuse to stay silent." She smiled faintly, running her fingers over the engraved letters. Though she never sought recognition, she appreciated the gesture. It reminded her that her actions mattered, not just for herself but for everyone who felt powerless in the face of injustice. Clara continued her work quietly, keeping her focus on helping others rather than chasing accolades. Over time, her nonprofit grew into a nationwide network, empowering thousands of people to take control of their lives. Schools named scholarships after her, and legal organizations honored her contributions to reforming outdated practices. Yet, none of these accomplishments changed who she was at heart, a humble woman driven by compassion and a deep belief in fairness. Even Judge Hawthorne kept track of Clara's progress from afar. After retiring from the bench, he dedicated part of his time to mentoring young lawyers, encouraging them to follow Clara's example. He often recounted her story during lectures, emphasizing the importance of listening to those who might seem unassuming at first glance. "Never underestimate anyone," he would say. "Sometimes the strongest voices come from the quietest people." And so, Clara's legacy lived on, not through grand gestures or dramatic speeches, but through the countless lives she touched. Whether it was a single mother fighting eviction, a farmer challenging unfair zoning laws, or a teenager learning about their rights for the first time, Clara's influence reached far beyond the walls of that courtroom. She proved that real change starts with ordinary people willing to stand up and speak out, no matter how daunting the odds may seem. Years passed, and life moved forward for everyone touched by Clara's story. The courtroom where she had fought her battle became a symbol of hope for many, a place where ordinary people realized they could stand up against powerful institutions and win. For Clara, however, the victory wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about justice, fairness, and proving that even the quietest voices could make a difference when given the chance. After the trial, Clara returned to her quiet life in the small-town library, shelving books and helping children find stories that sparked their imaginations. She didn't seek out interviews or public appearances, though reporters continued to call and write letters asking for her perspective on various issues. Each time she politely declined, explaining that her focus remained on serving her community in whatever way she could. But while Clara tried to keep a low profile, her impact rippled far beyond what she ever imagined. Her nonprofit organization grew steadily, fueled by donations from people inspired by her courage. What started as a modest effort to help others navigate legal challenges soon blossomed into a nationwide network of volunteers dedicated to empowering everyday citizens, lawyers, paralegals, Retired judges, and even college students studying law joined forces with Clara, offering their time and expertise to assist those who couldn't afford professional representation. Workshops were held in community centers, schools and libraries teaching people how to understand their rights and advocate for themselves. Online resources expanded too, providing free guides and templates to simplify complex legal processes. Clara often led these workshops herself, speaking not as a hero, but as someone who understood firsthand how overwhelming the system could feel. "You don't have to be a lawyer to fight for what's right," she'd tell the attendees, her voice calm yet full of conviction. "All you need is determination and a willingness to learn. And sometimes just standing up and saying, 'This isn't fair,' can start a chain reaction that changes everything." Her message resonated deeply, especially among marginalized communities who had long felt ignored by the legal system. One woman, a single mother struggling to keep her home after an unfair eviction notice, attended one of Clara's seminars. Inspired by Clara's example, she decided to represent herself in court, using the tools and knowledge she gained from the workshop. When she won her case, she sent Clara a heartfelt letter thanking her for giving her the confidence to believe in herself. Stories like this poured in regularly, each one reinforcing Clara's belief that change was possible, one person at a time. Meanwhile, Judge Hawthorne's life took a different turn. After retiring from the bench, he found himself reflecting more deeply on his career and the lessons he'd learned from Clara. He began mentoring young lawyers, encouraging them to approach their work with empathy and integrity. "The law isn't just about rules and regulations," he'd say during lectures at local universities. "It's about people, real people, with real lives and real struggles. Never forget that." He also became an advocate for reforming outdated practices within the judicial system, citing Clara's case as a prime example of why transparency and accountability mattered. His transformation didn't go unnoticed. Colleagues remarked on how much softer and wiser he seemed compared to the stern figure they once knew. Though he never sought credit for his efforts, many credited him with helping shift the culture of the courts toward greater compassion and fairness. Back in Clara's hometown, reminders of her legacy popped up in unexpected places. A new wing of the library was named after her, funded by anonymous donors who wanted to honor her contributions. Schools introduced programs focused on civic education, teaching students about their rights and responsibilities as citizens. Even the county government implemented reforms to address the systemic issues Clara had exposed during her trial, ensuring that assessments were conducted more fairly moving forward. One day, while visiting the library where she worked, Clara noticed something unusual near the entrance. A brass plaque had been installed, gleaming softly under the sunlight streaming through the windows. Beneath her name was an inscription that brought tears to her eyes. "Justice begins when ordinary people refuse to stay silent." She stood there for a moment, running her fingers over the engraved letters. It wasn't the words themselves that moved her. It was the realization that her actions had inspired others to speak up, to demand better, to believe in the possibility of change. She hadn't set out to become a role model or a leader, but somehow she had become both. Despite the accolades and honors, Clara remained grounded, focusing on the work that mattered most to her. Every morning she woke up early, brewed a cup of tea, and headed to the library, ready to face whatever the day might bring. Her daughter, now grown and pursuing her own dreams, often joked that her mom was the busiest retired person she knew. But Clara didn't mind. Helping others gave her purpose, and she couldn't imagine doing anything else. As the years went by, Clara's story continued to spread, inspiring countless individuals to take action in their own lives. Whether it was a tenant fighting against unsafe living conditions, a farmer challenging unjust zoning laws, or a teenager learning about their rights for the first time, Clara's influence reached far beyond the walls of that courtroom. She proved that real change starts with ordinary people willing to stand up and speak out, no matter how daunting the odds may seem. And so, Clara's legacy lived on, not through grand gestures or dramatic speeches, but through the countless lives she touched. Her quiet strength, unwavering determination, and deep compassion reminded everyone who heard her story that heroes aren't always the loudest or flashiest figures. Sometimes, they're the ones sitting quietly in the corner, reading a book, waiting patiently for their moment to shine. Clara showed the world that even the simplest acts of courage can leave an indelible mark, lighting the way for others to follow.